Good morning. It's 9 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and hop right into Bible class. So we are in Mark chapter 6. We covered Mark chapter 6 and verse 20. That's where we stopped, sort of right in the middle of the story of John the Baptist. And so what we're going to do, starting off class, we're going to jump back to Mark chapter 6 and verse 14 and just read the 6 verses leading up to where we left off, so we can sort of be in the same mindset, and then we'll hop in with verse 21 and start discussing it. Okay, pick up in Mark chapter 6, start in verse 14, and we're going to read through verse 20. Mark 6:14. Now King Herod heard of him, speaking of Jesus, for his name had become well known. And he, this is Herod, said, John the Baptist is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him. Verse 15. Others said, it is Elijah. And others said, it is the prophet, or like one of the prophets. Verse 16. But when Herod heard, he said, this is John, whom I beheaded. He has been raised from the dead. For Herod himself had sent and laid hold of John, and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, for he had married her. Because John had said to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Verse 19. Therefore Herodias held it against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not. For Herod feared John, knowing he was a just and holy man, and protected him. And when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. That's where we left off at the end of last week. So leading up to this, you have Jesus, who earlier in Mark chapter 6 has sent out the 12 on their own work in pairs of 2. And so they're doing mighty works, and Jesus is doing a lot of work, healing a lot of people, teaching with authority. And so Herod, King Herod, hears of this. Herod Antipas, this was one of the sons of Herod the Great, who was put in power by Rome whenever they took over Judea. And so John the Baptist, he says, this is John the Baptist raised from the dead, whom I beheaded. And then the Bible gives you the account of what happened with John the Baptist. And so the summary, we saw a little bit of that, is John the Baptist was in prison. Why? Because he was preaching to Herod, you have your brother Philip's wife. And so John is thrown into prison. He's being held there. And the wife of Herod's brother Philip was Herodias. And she did not like John. You can imagine why, because he's saying the marriage you're in is unlawful. God doesn't approve. All right. So that's where we left off. And let's pick up here in verse 21. This is where you're going to see more of, at this point, John is in prison. You know he's died. This is sort of recounting to you what happened when he was in prison. All right, look at Mark chapter 6 and verse 21. Then an opportune day came when Herod on his birthday gave a feast for his nobles, the high officers, and the chief men of Galilee. And when Herodias' daughter herself came in and danced and pleased Herod and those who sat with him, the king said to the girl, ask me whatever you want, and I will give it to you. All right, the Bible doesn't tell you what her name was, but Josephus writes a lot about this. Salome, S-A-L-O-M-E, was historically what her name was. And so she was actually Herod's stepdaughter and niece. If you want to go on Google and look up, you can find charts of the Herods and how intermingled their family trees were, right? And so he has his niece and his stepdaughter, okay, who is doing what? She's doing the hokey pokey, right? No. From what you see in the context, this is likely what kind of dance? Remember in the book of Esther? What happened in the book of Esther? It's a sort of a different, similar scenario, but way earlier time. You had the king who called his wife Vashti and said, hey, I want you to come and dance before all my men at a party. And what did she say? No, I won't do it, right? And so he basically deposed her, banished her from being a queen, and that's how Esther rose to the throne, right? But Vashti, who I think it's interesting, who was not one of God's people, but she was honorable, and so God puts her name in the Scriptures. But then you have this woman who is basically doing a striptease for her uncle and stepfather, and the Scripture leaves her name out, okay? And so what you have here is in verse 23, it says, he also swore to her, and swores in the imperfect tense. So the way I envision this, imperfect means continuing action in the past, right? So what you have here is you have She's dancing for him and all of his buddies, all of his high officers at his birthday party. Okay, likely a striptease type dance. Definitely something that would classify as lasciviousness. Okay, and so she's dancing, and so he, in front of all his buddies, is telling her over and over what? Whatever you want. Look at verse 23. He swore to her, whatever you ask me, I will give you up to half of my kingdom. All right? So there's this party, and she's dancing, and he's saying, hey, whatever you want, I'll give you everything up to half my kingdom. Okay? And who's present here with him? All of his buddies. Okay? And so look at what happens. Look at verse 24. So she went out and said to her mother, who would her mother be? Herodias, right? Went out and said to her mother, what shall I ask? And she, Herodias, said what? The head of John the Baptist. Verse 25. Immediately she, this is Salome, came in with haste to the king, to Herod, and asked, saying, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Now what does the king start to realize? He made what kind of vow? Rash vow, something he shouldn't have made. And look at what it says here in verse 26. And the king was exceedingly sorry, yet because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he what? Did not want to refuse her, right? This is the same word in Greek, the use of the rich young ruler in Matthew 19 where he went away sorrowful. So here you have King Herod. He is sorrowful. Well, why? Last week we talked about a few reasons he didn't want to put John the Baptist to death. One of them is he liked hearing him what? Preach, weirdly enough, all right? Because he's preaching, you're in an unscriptural marriage. But maybe the other things that he was preaching, Herod enjoyed hearing, right? And then the other reason, in Matthew's account, tells us because Herod was afraid to put him to death because of the who? The people. Because the people thought John was a prophet. And so you have Herod who's afraid to put John the Baptist to death because, hey, there might be some repercussions. And the last thing he wants, as somebody put in power by Rome, is what? Some sort of revolt or uprising, okay? Because Rome would say, well, you're not doing your job, and who knows what his fate would be. Okay. Yes?
He compared him to Jesus based off prophet and preaching.
So last week, we talked about that a little bit, which is, the Bible says John the Baptist never worked a miracle. But he was preaching. He was an inspired preacher. And he had these massive droves of people, maybe Matthew 3:5, I think it might be. Or maybe it's Mark 3:5. Said he had all of Jerusalem, Judea, and the surrounding area coming to him to be baptized. So he had these massive crowds of people, but the Bible says he never worked a miracle. Now, Jesus and his disciples are working miracles, and Herod says, this must be John the Baptist who I put to death. So I don't know if he's referencing the fact that he had these massive crowds around him the same way that John the Baptist did. I don't know if maybe some of these miracles, by the time they get to him, he's hearing. I really don't know. But for whatever reason, it is interesting that John the Baptist is so prominent in the mind of Herod that when Jesus comes along, he compares those two to each other. So, but yeah, that's a really good question is, well, if he wasn't working miracles like Jesus, why was he having this, massive following? It must just be the power of his preaching. That's what it seems to me. In fact, here a little bit later, I think there's going to be something else in this context that when we wrap up the story, I have some notes about it too. So, okay, he was exceedingly sorry, yet because of what? The oath that he made and because of who's with him. Those who sat with him, which is who? Verse 21, his nobles, his high officers, and the chief men of Galilee, right? So this is peer pressure in a sense. He makes this oath, and then all these men who are, his friends, the people that he probably, I don't want to say looks up to, but maybe respects because he's the leader, but they're prominent people too. He says, well, I made this vow, and so therefore I can't what? I can't go back on it. He didn't want to appear weak, that's for sure. Back then when the governments were the way that they were, if you were a leader but you appeared weak, what might happen? Yeah, somebody may say, hey, this guy's weak, we need to overthrow him, right? We need to assassinate him, someone else can take power, okay? Look at verse 27. So this is what Herod does. Immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded his head to be brought. And he went and beheaded him in prison and brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl, which would be Salome, and the girl gave it to her mother, which would be Herodias. When his disciples heard of it, they came and took away his corpse and laid it in a tomb. All right, what are some things that you think overall we can learn about can learn from the story of John the Baptist? There's no like one or two right or wrong answers. What are some things that stand out to you about the story of John the Baptist? Stood up for the truth. Even when it cost him his what? His head. Yeah. You know, I think I mentioned this. I can't remember if I talked about this in last week's class or if I talked about it somewhere traveling where I was speaking or what. But, you know, the show out that's called The Chosen, where they basically have done, I think, a pretty good job of depicting, at least in my mind, from what I've read in the Scriptures, the type of personality that I think Jesus may have had, right? But the one thing I didn't like in that is when they showed John the Baptist telling Jesus he was going to go preach the truth about his marriage to Herod, and the writers of The Chosen made Jesus almost sort of say, like, well, I've got more important things to do than that, right? That's the one thing I really didn't like about The Chosen in season 1, which is, or maybe it's season 2, I don't remember. But anyway, Jesus came to seek and save men from what? Sin, right? And John the Baptist is inspired, so what he's preaching is from the Holy Spirit, which is, the Holy Spirit's a member of the Godhead. So John the Baptist is preaching the truth because he wants to save Herod from his what? From his sin. So John the Baptist had enough integrity to preach on something that's very hard to preach to somebody who ultimately had the power to kill him, and ultimately what happened? He was killed. All right. I have a list in my notes of the sins that were involved in this story. You had Herodias. She had a vengeful heart because she heard the truth and she didn't what? Like it. So the first opportunity she got, she did what? She wanted to kill John the Baptist. I have the idea that the Bible doesn't say in there that drunkenness was involved, but let's be real. Does anybody in here think they had this big party and she's strip-teasing before a bunch of leaders and there wasn't alcohol involved, right? I think, of course. I don't think anybody would argue that. Number 3, you have peer pressure, which caused him to do something he didn't want to do, but he made also a rash vow, right? So there's a lot of things we can learn from the story of John the Baptist. Anybody else have anything you want to add before we sort of move past this story? Yes, Joe. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Joe made a great point. I don't know if everybody could hear him. He basically said, I'm going to look, I think it's Matthew 11:11, make sure I get that right. Yeah, Matthew 11:11. This is what Jesus said about John the Baptist, Joe referenced. Assuredly, I say to you, among those born of woman, there has not risen one greater than John the Baptist. So he basically says, look, up until John the Baptist, since the time of creation, there has not been what? Anybody greater, right? What does that mean? Probably in character, okay, in his preaching. You think back, what Joe said is exactly right. You know, you may say, how would John the Baptist stack up against Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah? And Jesus says what? He's at the top, which is pretty impressive praise for John the Baptist. In essence, maybe that's why God allowed him to be the one that prepares the way for who? The Messiah. All of human history has been waiting for Jesus, the Messiah, to save the world from their sins. And God says, John the Baptist, you're going to be the one that does it. And he gets to be related to him, right? I guess we're related to Jesus, you know, spiritually. But that'd be pretty cool to be his physical relative as well. So that's a great point, Joe. Great point. Yes, sir.
While he said that, wouldn't John the Baptist have wondered whether Jesus was the one in prison? You know, so it just shows how human he was. He's a great man, but still, God shows us every day that we can aspire to be that way. You know, because these guys had the same doubts and wonderments, you know.
That's a great point. He referenced the fact that even as great as John the Baptist was, when John the Baptist was in prison, he sent message to, maybe through some of his disciples or his message to Jesus' disciples. I can't remember exactly where it is. But he basically said, are you the Messiah? Are you the Christ? Or is there someone else? And Jesus said, send him word. He quoted, I think, Isaiah. Tell him that the lame walk, the blind see. So Jesus gets this message from John the Baptist. And John the Baptist, as great as he was in prison, maybe had some doubts. And he says, are you really the Messiah? And Jesus answers him and says what? Yes. He doesn't say, how dare you, John? Come on, you should know better than that, right? So I think that's one of the marks of inspiration in the Scriptures in general, is that the Scriptures always, contrary to what other secular historical documents do, the Scriptures always record not only the successes of men, but also their what? Their failures. And if you go read the Sennacherib prison, who was a ruler of Assyria, You know, he talks about all his victories, but then whenever he has that massive defeat at Jerusalem in 2 Kings 19, he doesn't mention that, right? So that's one of the things that the Bible always does. It talks about the great things and the failures, which is helpful for us, right? Because when we think about these prophets, sometimes we think that they were like superhuman, right? And no, James 5 says when Elijah, he was a man, what? With a like nature to ours. Joe.
Made a reference to Matthew 11:11.
Yes, sir.
Going along with what Charles said too, is the latter part says, notwithstanding, he that is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. Greater than who? Than John.
Yeah.
As great as John was, why is it that those of us that are in the kingdom of heaven, and I think it has reference to the church here,
Yeah.
why are we greater than John?
Yeah. Yeah, Joe, so Joe's point, Matthew 11:11, the second part of it, is it 11:11 or 11:12? 11:11. Assuredly I say to you, those born of woman, there is not arisen one greater than John the Baptist, but he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. So you could say, well, why is that? I think it's the privilege that you have to be in the kingdom. When I think of 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 10 or 11, it says, all the prophets prophesied of the grace that we're to receive, speaking of the salvation in the church. And it says, even those things, maybe verse 11 or 12, that even angels desire to look into. So we are, when you look at the first chapter of 1 Peter, privilege is the word that comes to my mind over and over. You know, it says the prophets wrote about things that they didn't even know what it meant. I mean, in essence, it's like if I wrote a message and I gave it to Joe to deliver to you all, and Joe got up here and read it, and he's reading it, and he doesn't quite understand every single thing if I haven't explained some things to it. That's what the Bible technically says the prophets were doing. They were preaching things, a lot of times prophecies, they had no idea when they're going to be fulfilled. But they were inspired men, and they're all preaching. Jesus said in Luke 24 that all the law and the prophets, what? Were pointing to who? To Christ. So all these things that angels and prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, all those men were looking to, a lot of them were writing things that were for who? For us. Even things angels were trying to look into and figure out what was going on. So, someone lost a hex bolt. There you go. Okay. Great points. Any other comments? Really good. Okay. Look at Mark chapter 6 and verse 30. So this is going to talk about the news being delivered to Jesus. Mark 6:30. Then the apostles gathered to Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. Now, I think, I'll give you an overarching view of where I'm going. The story later, the disciples are going to be on a boat, and Jesus is going to come to them walking on the water, right? And there's a section in there where it says, and Jesus meant to pass them by, all right? What does that mean, okay? Anybody ever been here at Walmart and you see somebody that you know and you love them, but you're sort of in a hurry and you don't want to talk to them, and so you what? I'm not going to say you've all done it. Some of you in here have done it. I've done it. Where it's like you see somebody and you'd like to say hi, but you have some other stuff, so you kind of just put your head down and sort of scoot on by, right? For a long time, I thought that's what Jesus was doing with the disciples, maybe because he was annoyed at... Sometimes if you read the Gospels, what did the disciples argue about? Who's going to be the greatest? And here you have Jesus who's going to die on the cross, and he's got these guys arguing who's going to be the greatest, right, among them. And Jesus probably thinking, look, you guys, you got to meet Abraham. You got to meet John the Baptist, okay? Anyway, so I always thought Jesus was trying to sort of just get by them quickly. But if you look at this account, now look at something with me. Look at Mark 6:29. Mark 6:29 says, when his what? Disciples heard of it, okay? Speaking of John the Baptist's death, they came and took his body away. Look at Mark 6:30. Then the what? Apostles gathered to Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. So in Mark's account, at least initially, I thought that was like two bookends. So like, story of John the Baptist, the disciples took away the body. Oh, verse 30, now we're jumping back to the apostles coming back from the limited commission, and they're telling Jesus all the things they had done. But look at Mark's account. Look at Matthew. Look at Matthew 14. I think Matthew 14 helps us kind of connect these two stories a little bit better than... So look at Matthew 14. Okay, look at 11. Matthew 14, go to verse 11. Let's read 11 and 12. Matthew 14:11. And his head, John the Baptist, his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl. She brought it to her mother. Then the disciples came and took away the body and buried it and went and told who? Jesus. So they basically go pick up the body of John the Baptist. They go and bury it. Then they go and tell who? Jesus. And that, I think, is going to influence what the next two accounts you read about, which are him feeding the 5,000 and Jesus walking on the sea in the middle of the night. Okay? So go back to Mark. Go back to Mark chapter 6 and verse 31 now. So Mark 6:31. And he said to them, this is Jesus, "Come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest for a while. For there were many coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. So they departed to a deserted place in the boat by themselves." All right, now this is maybe a side note, but they took a boat to a what kind of place? What's the King James say? Desert place. The New King James says deserted place. I have heard people sometimes in Acts chapter 8 with the Ethiopian eunuch say there's no way he was immersed because he was in a what? A desert. Well, guess what? In the Bible, desert means what? This is deserted, right? So they took a boat to a deserted place, which means that desert place doesn't always mean what? No water. That's just a small side note, okay? But you can have something like Antarctica and the Arctic. They're what? They're deserts by our definition because they only have a certain amount of rainfall, okay? Anyway, all right, so they departed to a deserted place, a desert place, in the boat by themselves. Verse 33. But the multitude saw them departing, and many knew him, and ran there on foot from all the cities. They arrived before them and came together to him. So basically, they get in a boat to get away, and what happens? The people run to meet them where they get off the boat. Verse 34. And Jesus, when he came out, he saw a great multitude, and was moved with compassion for them, because they were like sheep not having a what? Shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. This is similar language to like Ezekiel 34:5, which basically talked about the people being scattered without a shepherd. And Ezekiel 34:23 said this, "I will establish one shepherd over them, he shall feed them, my servant David." Now Ezekiel's way after David, so he's talking about who? A king like David, okay, which would be the Messiah. Acts 2 talks about that. All right, look at verse 35. When the day was now far spent, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted or desert place, and the hour is already late." This is the disciples speaking to Jesus. "Send them away, that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat." So basically the disciples tell Jesus, hey, you need to send these people away so they can go take care of what? They need to go buy their own food. Look at how Jesus responds. Verse 37. But he, Jesus, answered them and said, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat?" Okay, what's a denarius, which is the singular form? Day's wage. That's right. Okay. So essentially they're saying, Lord, are we going to go buy food for 5,000 people with 200 days' wages? All right. And in fact, in John 6:10, this is a parallel account of this. The word used there is the word for male or husband, not mankind. Anthropos is the Greek word for mankind. Aner is the word for male. So in John's account, there's 5,000 men, right? I don't know if there were other women or children with any of them, but there's at least 5,000, possibly what? Possibly more, okay? Some have said maybe 10,000 total. I don't know how many kids and women I think are traveling around in the first century out in the deserts with these people. Maybe they are, I don't know. At least 5,000 men we know, okay? So they have 5,000 men, and look at verse 38. This is what they have to feed. The men say, hey, we can't pay for this much food with this much money that we have. And so Jesus, look at verse 38. But he said to them, well, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they found out, they said that they have five loaves and 2 fish. John's account tells us they were barley loaves, and John's account says 2 small fish, right? So for 5,000 men, they have what? 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, all right? This is not just rationing, okay? This is going to be a what? A miracle, right? Sometimes people hear these miracles and they think this is ridiculous. And I say the same thing every time. If you believe that God created the what? Universe, then this should be what? Simple. This is easy. When someone says, you really think Noah built a boat and saved 8 people from a year-long flood? Well, yeah, that's easy if God can speak a universe into existence, all right? So anytime somebody ever tells you a miracle is ridiculous, I always just take them back and start talking about creation. Do you think that nothing exploded and created everything, or that there is an uncaused cause, a being, God, that spoke this universe into existence? If he did that, everything else is easy. Okay, so Jesus is going to perform a miracle here. Look at verse 39. Then he commanded them to make them all sit down in groups on the grass. So they sat down in ranks, in hundreds, and in 50s. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, he blessed and broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples, and set before them, and his disciples to set before them, and the 2 fish he divided among them all. All right, what does it mean when he blessed it? When someone asks you to bless the food, are they asking you to say, if me and Dwayne go to eat lunch, am I saying, Dwayne, you want to bless the food? Do I think Dwayne has some miraculous power to make this food, this super double cheeseburger, super healthy, right? No, when I say ask him to bless it, what am I asking? Give thanks for it. If you want to look in your notes, Mark chapter 14, verses 22 and 23, it's talking about the institution of the Lord's Supper. And it says they took bread, verse 22, and blessed it. Verse 23, they took the cup and had given thanks, right? So blessed it means given thanks, okay? So Jesus looks up to heaven, gives thanks to his Father for the 5 loaves and 2 fish, okay? And then in Mark 6:41, where it says he gave them, it's again in the original language imperfect, which means he what? Kept on giving them. It's like you go to Italian garden, Olive Garden, where they have the bottomless breadsticks. Is that what it is? As many breadsticks as you want. Or like Red Robin has the bottomless like French fries, right? I don't know how this miracle worked. The Bible doesn't give us all the details. But Jesus has 5 loaves, 2 fish, and he just keeps on what? It's like this bottom of this basket that just miraculously keeps repopulating, okay? And so verse 42 says, they all ate and were filled, and afterwards they took up what? 12 baskets full of fragments and of the fish. Now those who had eaten the loaves were about 5,000 men. And that word there, once again, is aner, man or husband. So this is 5,000 men. Maybe there are women and children there, all right? There's no other way in this account to say this is either a what? It's a miracle, or else it's what? A lie. It's a miracle or a lie. So don't buy some people that say, well, maybe it's just an allegory. There are certain things in the Bible that are allegories, and they tell you they're allegories, like Galatians 4. But this is a narrative account. So if you believe in the Bible, if you're going to be a Christian and follow the Bible, you have to believe in what? Miracles. You have to believe in the supernatural. If you don't, you should just give up on Christianity, right? Because the resurrection is the pinnacle of Christianity, what can save you from your sins, and that's a what? It's a miracle, right? Okay, so don't buy into some of the middle ground where they say, well, the Bible says he fed 5,000, but that's really what it meant is maybe he gave a snack. I mean, you couldn't even give a snack to 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish, right? This is a miracle. Okay. Any questions, comments, thoughts? Yes.
Significance to the fact that it says 5,000 men. Well, he could have just said 5,000 and not distinguished. So I think that actually means that there were that many men, and likely they had people with them.
Well, you think about when we talk about the Exodus. The Exodus recounts numbers how many what? Men. And then many of the accounts, it'll even say, and there were other women and children with them. So yeah, I mean, do I think there's not a single woman or child? No, I think there are probably some families. These people are coming to Jesus from all over for him to heal them. Do I think that there's probably a few, maybe quite a few people in there that have a child or a wife with an affliction they want Jesus to heal? I would think so. So it's at least 5,000 minimum, but likely much more. But either way, if it was 1,000 people, if Jesus fed this auditorium with 5 loaves and 2 fish, what would you call that? A miracle, okay? So it's a miracle. And nowhere near 5,000 people in this room. Okay. All right, look at verse 44. Now those men who eaten the loaves were about 5,000 men, okay? Now, go to John's account. Look at John's account in John 6. You can also tell, this is the problem you have if you start saying, well, this really wasn't a miracle, it was just an account. then you start running into a lot of other contradictions in the Bible, which ultimately will lead you to either Jesus worked miracles or you should just quit reading your Bible and quit claiming to be a Christian, all right? Look at John chapter 6 and verse 14. Then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, what did they say? Oh, wow, this guy's really good at delegation and portion control, right? No, they said this. This is truly the prophet who is to come into the world. Look at verse 15. Therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to what? Come and take him by force and make him a what? To make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. Mark's account tells us, look at verse 45. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he sent the multitude away. Verse 46, when he sent them away, he departed to the mountain to what? To pray, okay? So in John's account, they see this miracle and they say, this is the Messiah that Deuteronomy 18:15 talked about. There's going to come a prophet like Moses, a miracle worker. This is the Messiah, and they want to make him what? Physical king. And he says, no, that's not what I'm here for, okay? There are some groups that say Jesus' mission was to come and be a physical king and set up a kingdom on earth, and that Jesus failed, and he's going to do it later. Jesus didn't fail. He had every opportunity he wanted to become king on earth, and he realized that was not his what? Purpose. He says, no, my kingdom's not of this world. He told that to Pilate. Okay. So, they want to make Jesus king. He says, no thanks. He passes through the midst of them. He sends his disciples in a boat across, and then he goes up on a mountain to what? To pray. What are the things that have transpired in his life, right? It seems like it's the nighttime. I don't know when, but maybe it was earlier that morning. Maybe it was the day before. He just found out that what had happened? John the Baptist has been beheaded, right? He was related. He was close to John the Baptist, all right? He had a great affection for all men, of course. He's the Messiah, he's the Lord, but also for John the Baptist, okay? So he loves John the Baptist. He's found out that John the Baptist has been killed, okay? For what? For preaching the truth, okay? And so then he feeds all these people. They try to make him a king, and he says, no thanks. That probably would frustrate him a little bit, since they're not understanding his mission. So he goes up to a mountain alone for him to pray, okay? He sent the disciples to Bethsaida, that's on the west side of the Sea of Galilee, and let's look at Mark 6:47. This is where the miracle of him walking on water comes into play. Mark 6:47. Now when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. All right. Now, John 6:19, parallel account, says they had rowed 3 to 4 miles. The Sea of Galilee is about 8 miles wide. All right. So the Bible's given the right distances and accuracy. So Jesus is on the shore, and he sees them straining. And the next verse will tell us, they're in the middle of the sea, 3 to 4 miles away, right? I'm sure some of you got good eyes in here, right? Can you see what's going on 3 or 4 miles across a lake? What is this? Does Jesus have super good vision? Just 20/20, didn't have TV, he never sat too close to the television as a kid, right? That's what my parents told me. You're gonna go blind. Now my vision was pretty awful, so maybe they were right. But Jesus sees them 3 to 4 miles away in the middle of an ocean, right? Look at verse 48. Then he saw them straining at rowing. He not only sees them out there, he sees they're having problems rowing. For the wind was against them. Now about the 4th watch of the night, that's 3 to 6 in the morning, okay? About the 4th watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea, and he would have what? Passed them by. Like I said, I thought for a long time he just maybe was fed up with them. It's the middle of the night, doesn't want to talk to them. Now I have a whole different perspective, knowing he's gone to the mountain to pray alone. It's maybe the first time he's had to be alone since he found out that who's died. John the Baptist. I think that's why, and speculation, I think that's why he's trying to pass him by. He just wants some time, some peace to himself. His cousin John the Baptist has just died. Anyway, he's walking on the water. He would have passed them by. Look at verse 49. When they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it was a ghost and cried out. Now, I don't know if Job 9:8 says this. Job said, he alone spreads out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. I don't know if that was ever supposed to be a prophetic mention of the Messiah walking on water. I don't know. But Job 9:8 says that, interestingly enough. All right. Mark 6:50. They thought he was a ghost because, verse 50, they all saw him and were troubled. But immediately he talked with them and said to them, be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid. Then he went up in the boat to them, and the wind ceased, and they were greatly amazed in themselves, beyond all measure, and they marveled, right? So it says, as soon as he got up into the boat with them, what happened? The wind what? Ceases, all right? They have to think that this is similar to what earlier in this book, what happened. Mark 4, he calmed the sea, right? And in Mark 4 it said, who is this man that the winds and waves obey him, right? So now not only Jesus can calm the sea, but he can also what? Walk on the sea, okay? Don't go for the people that say, well, maybe there was a sandbar, and he just walked 3 or 4 miles out to the middle of the sea on a shallow sandbar, okay? In fact, what's missing from this account in Mark? What's a big part of this story that you'd say glossed over if you didn't know? This is what happens to Peter in this account, in Matthew's account? Yeah, this is in Matthew's account. This is a story where in Matthew 14, Peter basically says, Lord, can I come to you? And he starts to walk out, and he starts until he what? He starts to see the waves and the winds, and he gets scared, and he starts to what? Sink on the sandbar. No, there was no sandbar. It was a miracle. Jesus is walking on the water, okay? So that's in Matthew 14. That's where the parallel of Peter. Actually in John, go to John 6 again. This is, sometimes it's really fun to hop back and forth and put these, you can play like a detective, all right? Look at John 6:21. There's quite a few miracles involved in this account. You're going to have a lot of explaining to do if you try to explain away the miracles. Look at John chapter 6. Look at verse 20, just sort of pick up. He said to them, it is I, do not be afraid. Verse 21, then they willingly received him into the boat, and what's the next 3 words say? Immediately the boat was at the land where they were what? Going. But Jesus saw them in the middle of the ocean, 3 to 4 miles away from the coast. So what's that? It's a miracle. I mean, you can try if you want to say, well, maybe Jesus talked to them while they rowed another 3 or 4 miles. Anybody ever rowed in a canoe? Right? I used to go with my dad. We'd go down the south branch of the Potomac River. It was like 11 miles, and it took us like 6 hours. Okay, we fished along the way too. All right. Immediately, they were at the land. So this is another miracle. A couple miracles. Jesus walks on water. Peter walks on water. Jesus calms the storm. Jesus sees them in the middle of a storm, 3 or 4 miles out, and then the boat is immediately what? Seems to be transported to the land. All right. You can see why anybody who's around when all this stuff happens says, this guy is the Messiah. We need to make him what? King. And Jesus says, no, that's not my purpose. All right. Look at verse 52. Read 51 again, just to sort of lead into 52. Then he went up into the boat, and the wind ceased, and they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure and marveled. Right? If you put yourself in the next verse, this is going to be relevant. They are amazed and they marvel because Jesus did a what? Miracle. And if you're Jesus, maybe you thought, what? Where have you guys been? What has Jesus been doing for chapters now? Miracles, healing people, right? He's been calming storms. And so he walks on water and the disciples are like, wow. Which that would be amazing. But you've been seeing Jesus do these miracles, and look at what the next verse says. For they had not understood about the loaves because their heart was hardened. So what does that mean? What do you think it means before I give you mine? What do you think? They hadn't understood about the loaves. Do you think that they didn't know that Jesus worked a miracle? I don't think that's what it meant. Any thoughts before I give you mine?
Understand the physical part, but don't understand the spiritual part.
That's very good. Yeah, it's a really good one. Dwayne said maybe they understood the physical part, but maybe didn't understand the spiritual part, like the application. Like, wow, that guy just made food appear from nowhere. But maybe they didn't realize who he was. Because there have been other people that have performed miracles, right, in the Old Testament, but maybe they don't quite understand it. That's sort of the way I look at it. I look at it as they think he's a miracle worker, yes, but they don't understand necessarily who he actually is, right? And remember, we said in Mark, the first 8 chapters are leading you up to chapter 8 when Peter says, you are the Messiah, the Son of God, right? So this is still leading up, Jesus doing all these miracles, teaching them, hey, he's bringing them to the realization that this is the Messiah, the Son of God, okay? That's right. That's Mark 8. It's parallel with Matthew 16. That's all this is culminating in it, It says their hearts were hardened, okay? They were imperfect men. In my notes, you see this throughout the entire book. Mark 4:13, 7:18, 8:17, over and over and over, there are many times where Jesus is speaking to spiritual things and they aren't understanding it. They're not getting the bigger picture, which is exactly what you said, of spiritual. They're only looking at the physical, okay? They're forgetting his mission. That's right. Yep. He said, show us the Father. And he said, if you've seen me, you've seen what? The Father. They crossed over. They came to the land of Gennesaret. That's the Sea of Galilee, northwest shore. When they came out of the boat, immediately the people recognized him. We'll pick up there next week, and then we'll hop right into chapter 7. Thanks for your attention.